The silence that greeted Steffi when she stepped into the cliff house was not the kind that soothed or comforted. It was the kind that pressed against the skin, heavy and unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding back something too terrible to reveal all at once. The ocean beyond the glass stretched endlessly into the horizon, its waves moving with indifferent rhythm, but inside the house, everything felt suspended, frozen in a moment that refused to breathe. Steffi paused just inside the doorway, her instincts sharpening with a quiet urgency she could not explain. There had been too many moments like this in her life, too many times when stillness had masked catastrophe, when the absence of sound had been the first warning of something already broken. She called out softly at first, expecting an answer, expecting some sign of normalcy that would dissolve the tension coiling in her chest. But nothing came back to her except the faint echo of her own voice, swallowed almost immediately by the vast emptiness of the space. It was then that the unease began to take shape, no longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate and undeniable. Her steps quickened, each movement driven by a growing sense that she was already too late, that whatever had happened had unfolded in the quiet moments before she arrived. When she reached the living room, the sight that met her shattered whatever fragile composure she had been holding on to. Taylor lay slumped on the sofa, her body unnaturally still, her face pale in a way that spoke not of rest but of absence. The glass on the table beside her was empty, a faint trace of water clinging to its sides, and next to it, a bottle of sleeping pills lay on its side, its contents gone, its purpose fulfilled. For a second, Steffi could not move. The image refused to align with reality, refused to settle into something her mind could accept. And then it did, all at once, crashing into her with a force that stole the air from her lungs. She rushed forward, her hands trembling as she reached for her mother, calling her name with a desperation that rose uncontrollably from somewhere deep within her. Taylor did not respond. Her skin was cool, her breathing shallow, so faint that it felt like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. The memories came without warning, uninvited and merciless. Another time, another moment where Taylor had stood at the edge of the same darkness, where the weight of everything she had endured had nearly pulled her under for good. Steffi had lived through that fear once before, had watched helplessly as her mother's pain had consumed her, had fought with everything she had to bring her back. And now, standing here again, facing the same terrifying possibility, she felt something inside her begin to fracture. Her fingers fumbled for her phone as she called for emergency services, her voice shaking, barely holding together as she tried to explain what was happening. Every second felt unbearable, stretched thin by the fear that Taylor might slip away before help could arrive. She knelt beside her, her hands pressing gently against her shoulders, her voice breaking as she begged her to stay, to fight, to come back. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to look away, refused to let herself retreat from the reality unfolding in front of her. By the time Finn arrived, the house had become a space defined entirely by urgency and fear. He moved quickly, instinctively, assessing the situation with the practiced precision of someone who had faced crisis before, but even his calm could not fully anchor Steffi. When he pulled her into his arms, she clung to him, her body trembling, her thoughts spiraling beyond anything she could control. His presence grounded her physically, but her mind remained caught in a storm of questions and accusations, each one more painful than the last. This had not come out of nowhere. Taylor had been struggling, yes, but she had been fighting. She had been holding on, finding ways to move forward despite everything that had been thrown at her. So what had changed? What had pushed her back to this edge, to this point where the only escape seemed to be surrender? The answer formed almost immediately, rising to the surface with a clarity that felt both undeniable and unbearable.
Deacon.
The name burned through her thoughts, bringing with it a surge of anger so intense it nearly eclipsed her fear. He had been there, woven into the fragile fabric of Taylor's emotional recovery, offering something that had seemed like hope but had always carried the risk of collapse. His connection to Sheila, his inability to fully separate himself from the chaos that surrounded him, had always been a shadow hanging over everything. And now, as Steffi looked at her mother lying motionless before her, that shadow felt like the source of everything that had gone wrong. When Deacon appeared at the doorway, his presence only intensified the storm already raging within her. His expression was one of shock, of genuine horror, but beneath it, there was something else, something that looked too much like guilt. Steffi saw it immediately, seized on it, allowed it to confirm everything she was already feeling. Her voice broke as she turned on him, her words spilling out with a force she could not contain, accusing him of breaking Taylor, of dragging her back into a world of pain she had fought so hard to escape. Deacon did not defend himself. He could not. Because in that moment, standing there with the weight of what had happened pressing down on him, he felt it too, the crushing realization that his presence in Taylor's life had not brought the stability he had hoped for, but had instead reopened wounds that had never truly healed. He had believed, perhaps naively, that love could be enough, that he could offer her something stronger than the ghosts of her past. But love, as he was now forced to confront, was not always a shield. Sometimes it was simply another vulnerability waiting to be exploited. He stepped forward slowly, his movements careful, as if approaching too quickly might shatter whatever fragile hold Taylor still had on life. When he reached her, he hesitated for only a moment before kneeling beside her, his hand finding hers, holding it with a tenderness that carried both devotion and regret. This was not how it was supposed to be. He had wanted to protect her, to give her something better, something safer. Instead, he was here, watching as she slipped into the same darkness he had promised himself he would never let her face alone again. The paramedics arrived, their presence cutting through the emotional chaos with a sharp, focused urgency. They worked quickly, efficiently, assessing, stabilizing, preparing to move her. Steffi watched them with a desperate intensity, searching their faces for any sign, any indication that Taylor would be okay, that this would not end the way she feared it might. Finn stayed close, his hand never leaving hers, his quiet reassurances the only thing keeping her from completely unraveling. As Taylor was lifted onto the stretcher, the reality of the situation settled more heavily over everyone present. This was not just an accident, not just a moment of weakness that could be easily explained or dismissed. There was something deeper here, something unresolved, something that had driven her to this point despite everything she had fought through before. And beneath it all, a question lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. What had truly pushed her over the edge? The answer was not simple, not singular. It was a convergence of everything that had come before. The years of trauma, the weight of choices, the echoes of past relationships that had never fully released their hold. But there was something else as well, something more immediate, more specific. Something that had happened recently, something that had shifted the balance in a way that could not be undone. As the ambulance doors closed and the siren began to wail, cutting through the quiet of the night, Deacon stood there, his gaze fixed on the place where Taylor had been just moments before. The accusations, the guilt, the fear, they all remained, swirling together into something that refused to settle. But beneath them, beneath everything, there was a new resolve beginning to take shape. This could not be the end of the story. If Taylor survived, and he forced himself to believe that she would, then the truth would have to be uncovered. Not just the truth of what had happened tonight, but the deeper truth that had led her here, the forces that had pushed her to a place where escape had seemed like the only option. He could not undo the past, could not erase the pain she had endured, but he could refuse to let it claim her completely. And as he stood there, the sound of the ambulance fading into the distance, one thought remained, sharp and unrelenting. If Sheila's shadow had reached this far, if her threats and manipulations had woven themselves into Taylor's fragile state of mind, then this was not over. Not by a long shot. The news did not arrive like a storm. It did not explode across the town in a single, shattering moment. Instead, it seeped into every corner of Los Angeles with a quiet, suffocating inevitability, carried through hushed phone calls, trembling voices, and the kind of silence that follows words no one is ever prepared to hear. By the time the sun had fully risen, the truth had already taken hold, cold and irreversible. Taylor was gone. At the hospital, the final moments had unfolded with a cruel simplicity that left no room for hope to survive. Machines that had once pulsed with fragile promise slowed, faltered, and then stilled, their steady rhythm dissolving into a flat, endless tone that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the room. Doctors had done everything they could, their efforts precise and relentless, but there are battles the body cannot win once the damage runs too deep. The toxin, the pills, the weight of everything that had led to that moment, it had all converged into a single, devastating outcome. And when it ended quietly, without spectacle, as if even death itself understood that there was nothing left to take. Steffi felt it before she fully understood it. There was a shift in the air, a subtle change in the way the room held itself, in the way people moved around her with a careful distance that spoke volumes without saying anything at all. When the doctor approached, his expression was already enough. She did not need the words. She did not want them. And yet they came anyway, each one landing with a weight that crushed whatever fragile hope she had been clinging to. Something inside her broke in that moment, not with a sudden snap, but with a slow, devastating collapse that left her unable to hold herself together. The sound that escaped her was not a scream in the traditional sense, but something deeper, something raw and unfiltered, pulled from a place that could not be reached by logic or comfort. It was grief in its purest form, stripped of restraint, of dignity, of anything that might soften its impact. Finn held her as she crumbled, his arms the only thing keeping her from falling completely, but even he could not shield her from the truth that had just taken root. Taylor was gone. The words repeated in her mind, over and over, refusing to settle into something she could accept. Gone meant final. Gone meant no second chances, no explanations, no opportunity to understand why things had unfolded the way they had. Gone meant that every unanswered question would remain exactly that, unanswered. Across the hospital, Deacon stood alone, the weight of the news pressing down on him with a force that left him momentarily unable to breathe. He had been too late. The realization carved through him with a precision that felt almost surgical, cutting away any illusion that he might have been able to change the outcome if only he had acted differently, arrived sooner, understood more. Regret flooded in, relentless and unforgiving, bringing with it every moment he had shared with Taylor, every promise he had made, every hope he had allowed himself to believe in. He had failed her. The thought settled into him with a finality that was almost unbearable. He had wanted to be her refuge, her protection against a world that had given her too many reasons to break. Instead, he had become part of the chain that led her here, part of the weight she could no longer carry. Whether through his connection to Sheila, through the complications of his own past, or simply through his inability to see how fragile Taylor truly was, he had contributed to the storm that had ultimately consumed her. And now, there was nothing left to fix. But grief does not remain static. It shifts, it evolves, it seeks something to anchor itself to when the loss becomes too vast to comprehend. For Deacon, that shift came quickly, transforming his sorrow into something sharper, something more dangerous. Because even as the narrative of tragedy began to form around Taylor's death, even as the assumption of despair took hold, there was a part of him that refused to accept it. This was not that simple. The thought lingered, persistent and unyielding. Taylor had been struggling, yes. She had been carrying wounds that had never fully healed. But she had also been fighting. She had been searching for a way forward, for a way to rebuild something that had been fractured too many times. To believe that she had simply given up, that she had chosen to end everything without a deeper cause, felt wrong, incomplete. And then there was Sheila. Her name moved through his thoughts like a shadow, bringing with it a surge of anger that cut through the fog of grief. Sheila had always been a force of destruction, a presence that twisted everything it touched. Her threats, her manipulations, her relentless need to control and dominate, it had all left marks, scars that did not fade simply because time had passed. If Taylor had been pushed, if something had driven her to that final, desperate act, then Sheila could not be ignored as a possible source. The idea took hold, growing stronger with each passing moment. Elsewhere, the town began to react. News of Taylor's death spread quickly, rippling through the lives of everyone who had known her, who had loved her, who had been touched by her in ways both profound and subtle. The shock was universal, cutting across old alliances and past conflicts, leaving behind a shared sense of loss that could not be easily contained. People gathered in quiet clusters, their conversations hushed, their expressions marked by disbelief and sorrow. But beneath the grief, beneath the collective mourning, something else began to stir. Questions. They started small, almost hesitant, whispered in corners and behind closed doors. The circumstances of Taylor's death did not sit easily with those who knew her best. The empty bottle of pills, the timing, the events leading up to that night, it all felt too aligned, too convenient in a way that suggested something more than simple tragedy. Doubt began to take shape, fragile at first, but gaining strength as more pieces of the story came into focus. Steffi felt it too, though she resisted it at first, clinging to the narrative that made the most immediate sense, the one that gave her something to direct her pain toward. Deacon had been her target, her anger finding a clear path through the chaos of her grief. But as the hours passed, as the initial shock began to settle into something more stable, more reflective, the cracks in that narrative began to show. Her mother had not been weak. The thoughts surfaced slowly, pushing against the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. Taylor had faced darkness before and had found her way back. She had endured loss, betrayal, and pain that would have broken most people, and yet she had continued to fight, to rebuild, to move forward. To believe that she had simply surrendered without something more, without a force that had pushed her beyond her limits, began to feel increasingly impossible. And then, like a thread being pulled from the fabric of everything she thought she understood, another possibility began to emerge. What if this had not been her choice? The question lingered, dangerous in its implications, impossible to ignore once it had been formed. If Taylor had not chosen this, if something or someone had influenced the outcome, then the entire story shifted. It was no longer a tragedy born of despair. It was something else entirely. Something darker. As the episode drew to a close, the camera lingered on a quiet, almost forgotten detail. In the now empty Cliff House, the glass that had once held water still sat on the table, its surface catching the faint light filtering in from the ocean beyond. Next to it, the bottle of pills remained where it had fallen, its emptiness a silent testament to what had occurred. But there was something else. A faint residue along the rim of the glass, barely visible, something that did not belong. Something that suggested the presence of more than just water, more than just pills. It was subtle, almost insignificant, but in a story where every detail mattered, it was enough. Enough to raise a question. Enough to change everything. And somewhere, in the shadows of a truth not yet fully revealed, the consequences of Taylor's death continued to unfold, setting the stage for a revelation that would not only shake the town, but expose the fragile line between grief and deception, between loss and something far more calculated. Because if Taylor had not chosen to...
Oh,